All right, thank you guys for coming, for taking time on your Saturday, a summer Saturday. You guys are, it means a lot for us, or to us, that you guys made the effort to show up. My name is Clint Woods. I'm the president of Californians Advancing Civic Education. We are an organization that's dedicated to helping students like you do the things that you're going to be doing and lead the people. We've been running these summer sessions. This is, I looked it up, this is our 6th year running these summer sessions, where we bring in schools from all around the Bay Area and kind of give them a head start on what a lead the people program is going to look like for the rest of the year. So by show of applause, I guess, how many people here are here from Foothill High School? People are raising their hands. It's like, I feel that. Okay, so again, by show of applause, how many people are here from Amador Valley High School? Okay. So I can say that because I am an alum of Amador Valley High School back in. I know, so old. So old. Well before any of you were. Back in 1995, I went through the We the People program at Amador Valley High School. We won the national title. I have to mention that.
The only title
I will not hear me mention this at every single level from here on out. I will not do that. We did a parade. They gave us a parade down Main Street. Seriously. That's there was like 4 people there, but it was a parade. But we started, or I helped start this organization in 2011 in order to provide volunteer and financial support for the We the People program and programs like it, to basically just help kids, students and teachers do the most out of this program. And in my day job, I'm an attorney here in San Francisco. I'm a plaintiff's attorney. Ash, Ms. Brakefield, is a defense attorney, so my office is nowhere near as nice as this. But I tend to represent small consumers, small businesses, as they engage in litigation against big companies. So, like Facebook. So the rest of the folks up here are going to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. Sabrina, do you want?
Hi, I'm Sabrina. I am an alum of the program from Amador. I was on MIT 5, focuses on the Bill of Rights, which we'll learn about. And I am currently a law student at 3L at Berkeley Law. Really happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I guess. Yeah, so I'm also an Amador alum, 2014, Unit 6. I'm currently not doing anything related to We the People specifically, but I'm currently a consultant. I'm a stereotypical hacker. So I test web applications and mobile applications, that sort of thing. So privacy, a lot of good stuff there. But yeah, no, I actually did intern at the Congressional Research Service probably a year or so ago. So I was doing a lot of research into sort of public finance and how do you fund stuff like BART. So that's my background.
Hi everyone, my name is Vikram Srikanti. I'm also an alumni of the program. I went to Foothill and I graduated in 2012.
You can clap, it's fine.
I was on Unit 3. I am now a PhD student in computer science at Berkeley. And I've been doing this for 4 years, something like that. Oh, and we always forget to mention, or I always forget to mention this, that I'm one of the 5 presidents of the
Yay!
Hi everyone, I'm Beth Mankowski. Sorry I was late. I just didn't open now. It was really far away. Had to get a visa to come in here. You know how that is under the current administration. It's gonna be a fun summer.
Feel that.
Yeah, so I am not an alumni of the program. I've actually been involved with We the People and with CACE for the last 6 years now. good friends with Mr. Woods here, brought me into the program, and I'm obsessed. Formerly the chair of the board of CACE, had to step down because of my insane work travel schedule, but happy that I could be here today to talk with you guys and excited about the program. For my work, I am the pre-sales manager at Workday, which those of you in Pleasanton are probably familiar with. So I work with our healthcare customers, traveling around the country trying to get them to buy our software. Yeah. And I work on the financial side, so I don't know anything about HR.
Great. Great. Okay. So, yes. So the first thing we're going to do, and this is very, very technical stuff. First thing we're going to do is you should all have a handout that looks like this, right? Yes? Okay, so I want you to turn it around. If you don't, raise your hand. Turn it around to the blank side of the paper. And then, this is very technical, you're going to fold it in 3.
Oh, no.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah, so it stands up.
I hate
So this is going to be a name placard. Right? And again, stay with me, guys. All right? On the side that like stands up, so this side right here, you're going to write your name, the school you're from, and any pronouns that you'd like us to use. Okay? Everybody, for yourself. For yourself. We're going to use all the pronouns. Yes. Okay. Anybody have any questions on this very technical exercise?
Whoa. No.
Okay. While you are doing this very technical exercise, I do want to point out a group of people in the back of the room. If you guys want to wave, right? So who are you? They're alumni. So all the people in the back of the room, with the exception of Mr. Dedamore, are alumni from one of the last 2 years who have come to support you. Isn't that cool? You're going to get a chance to see them in action, in alumni action, in a little bit. It's going to be super fun. But it means a lot that all these folks from 3 different schools have showed up to give back to the program and support you guys here today. So now that I assume that everybody is pretty much done with this very technical exercise, I'm going to be handing it off to Mr. Wong, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about how generally a We the People hearing goes. First of all, before he gets started, how many of you in this room so far, other than the alumni obviously, have seen a We the People hearing? Raise your hand. Okay, so maybe like a quarter of you. Okay, so the rest of you have not. This is good. You're going to see a We the People hearing today. But before you do, Mr. Wong's going to talk a little bit about how it goes.
Yeah, so even before that, we should probably preface how the whole program is organized.
Sure.
So, you might have noticed how Sabrina and I introduced ourselves as like, oh, she's Unit 5 and I'm Unit 6. Have you guys ever know sort of how the units go or heard of them? Sort of, maybe not. Don't worry, you get a whole probably 2 months to be able to learn the whole book, so that's great. But here, we'll give you a crash course. So Unit 1, if you guys have this worksheet right here. So, who made this? Were you the one who made this beautiful thing?
I have no idea.
Okay. Well, either way, I think it is great. It is very, I don't know. It puts it into context. So yeah, first we have Unit 1, right? So we're looking at the historical and philosophical foundations of government. And this is probably one of the few times you'll actually hear the full name of the unit read out loud. But yeah, Unit 1, you're really focusing on philosophy. You're really focusing on being able to answer questions from more just if you ever had a philosophical discussion with your friends, why is that really the case? Or oh, why do we have this structure this way? Right, so that's really Unit 1. And you'll deal with philosophers like John Locke, Rousseau, and if you get really fancy, you'll get I don't know, Resnick and all these other modern day philosophers too. So that's Unit 1. Then we also have Unit 2, Framing of the Constitution. So I don't know if you guys have required reading about how the Constitution was written, a common one that, one that I know we had to read was summer of 1786 or something like that. 7, my bad. I was 1 year. I was really close there. But yeah, it's literally a whole unit on that book, basically. But yeah, so framing of the Constitution is so it's like you're talking about the Constitutional Convention, like the founders are talking to each other, like trying to figure out, like, okay, like this is a brand new thing. How are we going to form a modern day democracy as we know it? So yeah, you'll be reading a lot of Federalist papers. You'll be reading a lot about Hamilton, and yeah, it's a really fun unit. Yeah. So Unit 3, voting, due process, equal protection, and civil war. So this is a really fun unit because it really deals with like a really interesting time period in our nation's history, right? So it deals with a lot with like the Civil War, the events leading up to the Civil War, and a lot of the constitutional sort of conflicts that occurred during that time. So dealing with slavery, how do we deal with newly freed slaves in the country, and how do we protect them equally so that they aren't going to be sort of institutionally harassed, which I don't know if they did that successfully, but that's something for you to answer in Unit 3. Unit 4, institution of government. This is one of my favorite units because I worked for the U.S. government for a while. But yeah, so you learn about sort of what are all the institutions that sort of is involved with the U.S. government, right? Like you obviously have your Congress, which is made up of your House and your Senate, but there's so much more to how the government is structured, right? Like there's like the FBI, there's like different sort of executive agencies, and there's just like state governments too. So how are all these structured, and how does that lead to sort of the form of government that we see today in the news? Right. Unit 5, the Bill of Rights. If you are a legal scholar and you love being the one person in the room who's like, oh, like this court case, it said this, this, and this, or like, oh, Citizens United, 2010. See, this is why I'm not Unit 5. Yeah, like, so on and so forth. So, yeah, so Unit 5, you really get to explore a lot of, like, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, right? Really exploring, like, how our rights are protected by the Constitution, how do court cases interpret these rights that were written in the Constitution, right? Because the founders purposely sort of left a lot of open ends for us to be able to adapt to as times changed. And you might argue that, oh, they have done this well, you might not have done this well, or they might have not done this well. So that's what Unit 5 is all about, exploring this sort of change over time.
It's the lawyer unit.
Yeah, basically. Most people who come out of it become lawyers. And then Unit 6, my favorite unit, because it's my unit. No, I haven't, and I will not say it again in the future. But yeah, so citizens in the society in a globalized world. So if you love keeping up with the news, if you love sort of talking about civil rights issues, I mean, like you'll talk about civil rights issue all the time, but really, like Unit 6 is where you sort of take all this stuff that you're learning through all the other units and bring it to life, right? Like, so you look at how does it interact with like what we see on the news, right? Like, and we sort of discuss not just in the U.S., how does this apply to other countries? How does it apply to developing countries, right? And a lot of the time, like this deals with a lot of interesting issues such as like immigration or executive privilege, and really pushing you to the limits of what makes us a country, or what form of economy should we have, right? Like there's a lot of debate over socialism and capitalism. This is one of those units that gets to explore that. Pretty interesting question. There we go. Wait. And what it means to be a citizen. There we go. Yeah, what it means to be a citizen. So, yeah, I mean, it was really funny because it's like for a unit that was about being a citizen, when I was on the panel, I was the only citizen on the panel, which but I think it just represents like sort of the diversity of the program and sort of the diversity of the citizens in the world and the country. There we go. So yeah, that's a quick rundown of all the units. Any questions? Anything to add? People in the back? Okay, cool. So now we'll go into like an actual simulation. Right? Or no, we're going to walk through it first. Okay, there we go. Turn over your little sheet. Yeah, so look to the backside, it should say basic congressional hearing structure. So when I was interning on the Hill, I got to sit through a lot of these, but it's slightly different. So here, for the actual We the People competition, it tries to simulate what a congressional hearing is like. Have any of you guys watched a congressional hearing, or like looked on the Daily Show, and they were like playing clips of the congressional hearing? Okay.
Did anybody watch the Kavanaugh confirmation?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, and fun fact, I was actually there for the Zuckerberg hearing.
Oh.
I waited outside for 3 hours to get into that room, but it was well worth it. Oh yeah, 100%. Like
Did that come up and wind him up in between breaks?
well, I didn't see that, but like you could tell he was the one kid in the room who like over prepared for the test and wants to answer every single question, whether or not you wanted to ask him. And he was also just a lot shorter than I thought he was. He was like this small. I was like, that would seem like a small guy. But yeah, so I mean, with that said, right? So our democracy, a lot of it is based around trying to create civility, right? So in order to create civility, you need to go through a lot of procedural things in order to achieve that civility, right? So in this particular case, like for these congressional hearings, like you'll hear like people introduce themselves. So like in this case, like the judges will introduce themselves, and then you will get a chance to introduce yourself, just so both sides acknowledge each other exists. That you guys are on the same page in terms of how we want to start this conversation. So typically how it works is like if this is the judging panel and this is the hearing panel, or the witness panel, the judges will introduce themselves. So they'll kind of describe like kind of how we went down the line, saying like, oh, like I'm so and so, I work for this, blah blah blah. And then at the very end of it, they'll be like, okay, and now I'd like you to introduce yourself. So when you're on the panel, you're treated as an expert witness. Right, so as an expert witness, you're supposed to be knowledgeable about all things in your unit, and you will introduce yourself as, hi, my name is so-and-so, I am from blank school, I am unit blank, and my name, and yeah, these are my unit mates, and then like your unit mates will like introduce themselves one at a time, and then at the very end, the last unit mate will be like, and I am so-and-so, thank you for listening to our testimony, and yeah, thank you to our coaches, thank you to our timer, and you thank everybody, and once you're done thanking everybody, then you're like, we're ready to sort of show you what we've got. So that's that. Now the next big stage of like a congressional hearing is the actual testimony, right? So typically, what happens even in a real congressional hearing is that you're given 4 minutes to 6 minutes of sort of time to read out loud your prepared statement, right? So in this particular case, I think for the first round, it's going to be just 4 minutes. So you're going to be reading out, like as a panel, a prepared testimony. So these are going to be answering questions that you're given to your unit. And so for every single We the People competition, you're given 3 questions. And during one of these hearings, you're going to be answering one of these questions. And that testimony is supposed to address every single part of that question.
We will hand out the questions that you'll be getting for the regional competition in a little bit. So,
yeah, those questions haven't changed since forever, so we can
That's
safely
true.
get them out to you without fearing that, oh, are they going to show up in the competition? Yeah, so these are scripted, right? Like you prepare them beforehand, and you have like a binder out in front of you, and like you read them, and you like sort of because the judges haven't read these at all, right? So they're going to be listening to these for the first time, and a lot of the times you'll be figuring out, okay, what's the best way to word things, just so that like a judge can hear them instead of read them. So that's what the congressional testimony is like. And then after that fun part, right, is the Q&A part, or the question and answer, and at Foothill, I think you guys call it hot seat, right? And it's called hot seat for a very good reason, because now you're going to be grilled on everything you just said in the past 4 minutes. And then probably a lot of things that you didn't say in the past 4 minutes. So a lot of the times there'll be questions, like if you bring up an idea saying like, oh, we believe that immigrants should only be allowed on a sort of work basis, right? If you have a job in the United States. If that was your claim, then during Q&A sessions, judges will probably ask you, so back that up, right? Why do you believe that? And you'll be challenging a lot of the things that you said in your 4-minute testimony, as well as things that you may not have said in your 4-minute testimony. So this lasts for 6 to 10 minutes, depending on which round of competition you're at. I think for regionals, it's just 6 minutes. And then like once you get to state, it's still 6 minutes, right?
it's 8 minutes
8 minutes.
in California.
Okay, 8 minutes in California, and then up to 12 minutes into the final. 11 minutes? Yeah. So close. So close. But yeah, so you get time to basically show off all the knowledge and all the preparation that you've been doing for this one hearing. Right, and then at the very end, after you're done, judges will, typically the audience and the judges will clap, and then all is well, and then they'll give you kind of like feedback, depending on sort of how they thought your testimony went and how you answered certain questions. So based off of that, I mean, I kind of described the layout already. Okay, so yeah, now we'll kind of walk you through what an actual hearing is like.
By showing you. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We have these lovely alumni who will come here, and I've asked them to prepare a testimony just for you today. Nobody's ever heard this testimony before. Hopefully it's good. It might not be good. Do you guys want to come up, judges and alumni? Or the panel and judges?
The panel should be over here.
Yeah. That's fine.
Which side's
So, testimony here. Get more seats.
Make sure.
Yes.
Sure you guys
Yeah, just ran.
judges in that I'll get it.
I realized that at the moment I was in section. I had my last tenor saxophone section, and I in the car ride home it's actually expecting you later.
Okay. So, I can get everybody's attention. Okay, we're going to get started. When you're watching this testimony, I want you to pay attention to how the judges are reacting to it, but really pay attention to how this is the panel. This is going to be you. These folks over here are going to be me, right? So I want you to pay attention to how they're working together, how they're projecting their voices, hopefully, how their posture, and how they respond to the questions that they're asked. So I will time. You guys want to kick it off? You guys want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, okay, so I'm Shruti, alum from 2019 New People Program. I'm from Unit 5. Yeah. Oh, Amador Valley High School.
Hi everyone, I'm Sandra. I was her unit mate, so graduated last year on Unit 5 from
I'm Rachel. I'm from Foothill. I was in Unit 3, the best unit. I graduated, I guess, this last year. Hi, Ms. Sweetwater. Hi, Mr. McBride. I hope you're proud of me. Thank you.
So, what do you say to them?
Please introduce yourself.
There you go.
Yeah, we don't
Start here.
Hi, my name is Kavya.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Kavya Kachagana. I went to Amador this past year as well. Was in Unit 1, the actual best unit. And yeah.
Hi, my name is Joey Morrow. I was graduated from Foothill last year, and I was in Unit 3.
My name is Zoe Yao. I was Kavya's unit mate, so I was Amador Valley Unit 1 as well. And we have matching shirts. So that just goes. They are from Greece.
Yeah, Robin got that right. So, I mean, not so like flags or anything.
Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm from Amador's Unit 6, also from this past year. Just saying Unit 6 has information that you'll actually use later in life.
Well.
My name's Samson. I graduated from Irvington last year. We'd like to thank our timer and judges for listening with us, as well as all of our equipment.
So your question today is the only question. What is the full
how did it impact your understanding of rights, responsibility, and citizenship? You may begin when you're ready.
We the People is a unique educational program that focuses on the history and principles of the U.S. constitutional democracy. The program instills fundamental civic virtues and values of deliberation and cooperation that are important to an educated and engaged citizenry. Students develop these values and demonstrate their understanding of constitutional principles and U.S. history in the program's culminating activity, mock congressional testimonies.
The simulated congressional hearings encourage students to discuss real-world issues. According to George Washington University political science professor Amitai Etzioni, a shared value of discussion promotes a common good and healthy deliberation. Through discussion and study, students apply and display their knowledge through oral testimony.
We the People is the most effective avenue of promoting active citizenship because the program encourages analysis and critical thinking that pushes students to understand the government. We the People differs from most standard government classes in that it focuses on application, analysis, and critical thinking rather than textbook learning. Under the We the People program, students engage with the Constitution, parsing it for our nation's fundamental values and applying these principles to propose solutions for current issues.
Since its inception in 1987, We the People has helped over 30 million students become engaged and informed citizens. We as a panel have personally benefited from the program in the same way, and our perception of the world has fundamentally changed for the better. Personally, I have been able to see and understand the ideas and values of a diverse group of people. Being in Unit 6 specifically has been more active in being updated in current news, being more aware of the world around us. I have learned to research, group discussion, and public speaking skills that will help me in college and my future career.
After participating in We the People this past year, my understanding of rights, responsibilities, and citizenship has changed immensely. Initially, I viewed these concepts pretty simplistically. Rights are your favorite protections, responsibility is for overachievers, and citizenship has to do mainly with words born or words born. However, after months of delving into the Constitution, framers' letters, political philosophers, and history, I now hold a more nuanced understanding of ideas and how they work together. Just as rights can be bestowed, they can be taken. Thus, it is a responsibility and duty of citizens to ensure their rights are protected. As James Madison noted in the National Gazette, people must have civic education to watch over their government.
Personally, We the People introduced me to a whole world of philosophy that has significantly shaped how I view rights, responsibility, and citizenship. I've been able to apply my study of classical and natural rights philosophy to every field of my life. I could speak passionately for hours about why classical ideas of community and political obligation are more important than ever. I echo Cicero in Book 4 of De Republica because I believe that we must devote more energy to studying and applying philosophy in order to make positive change in the world.
We the People taught me that though constitutions are written on paper, nothing is set in stone. Our framers drew from previous philosophies and governments, all with differing understandings of how government should function. They created a structure flexible enough to adapt to the people's ever-changing beliefs in government, and rigid enough to withstand the same beliefs. Since the birth of our nation, we've drastically expanded our ideas of rights, who deserves them, and how to protect them. To paraphrase Socrates, it's clear that nothing is clear. Our understanding of rights, responsibilities, and citizenship is always changing, and it should as our nation becomes a more perfect.
In my case, We the People gave me a platform to demonstrate one of my passions and expand my knowledge of politics. We the People helped me to better grasp the systematic issues that our government faces today, and that we all have a responsibility to try to fix these problems. Unit 3 helped to teach the importance of rights through the lens of those who do not have those rights and how many are still feeling the ramifications today. We the People help to teach that being a citizen means that you can criticize government if they commit injustices. Overall, We the People help to change the way I look at our issues that our nation faces today. Thank you.
So, how exactly is We the People more important or informative than any other civics class? What makes it like different or special? Like, can I just learn about civic virtue in the regular AP Gov course? So, yeah.
So I would say that We the People promotes these ideas in a real-world setting. For example, the program has been so tangible that, according to a 2015 study by Georgetown University political science professor Diana Owen, We the People students are more likely to actually participate in politics because they're able to apply what they've learned through the program because they are able to apply it in their discussions.
Furthermore, with We the People, you're using information that is current rather than information from textbooks that can be 8 to 10 or even more years old. And you're able to use it and use it in future events that will be coming.
And while in an AP Gov setting, you might be taught about civic virtue, being preached to about what values are and what responsibilities you have is not the same as actually understanding why. It's essential for a citizen and people in the nation today. In a 2010 Fair Parts study by UT Dallas, they found that by having citizens actually participate in small projects, it actually helped promote their trust and a belief in the government.
So I think the We the People program has helped all of you guys very clearly to better grasp the situations going on in our world. But do you think that the program has helped you shape like your future career paths or what you want to study in college, things like that?
It certainly has, actually. So myself being in a Unit 1, I have taken a special liking to classical philosophy. And so this fall, actually, I'll be taking part in a classical literature and philosophy seminar at my university so that I'm able to not only deeply understand what I've already learned this past year, but also to expand my knowledge beyond just classical philosophy, but also classical study.
Furthermore, We the People helped me solidify the passion I've had for a very long time and go into the field of politics. Throughout most of my career in high school, I did want to go into politics. We the People helped me not only keep up that passion, but also to expand it into my college in the future.
We the People has also helped my major choice. While I'm not majoring in a purely humanities major, I'm doing my major combines humanities and bio, and I'm actually taking a lot of philosophy classes for the humanities aspect to continue that learning.
People influenced my major. Well, I went from trying to study electrical engineering to electrical engineering and society. Instead of just focusing on technology, We the People showed me how important government society is. So I'll be studying both how technology can.
How have you all personally applied the skills that you've learned in the We the People class and how?
So one major thing that I've taken from this program is civic virtue, especially the notion that citizens have an obligation to the government, as Aristotle cites in Book 4, Part 4 of Politics. Specifically, I feel that there is an obligation for me to kind of give back to my community. And so I have taken a lot of time out of school year to participate in local volunteering events. I'm also part of a service organization that also propels these same civic virtue and community obligations.
Furthermore, I've gone on to educate people around me and to help other people around me understand the world around them. For example, with my friends and family, when they do not understand what's going on in the world or they think a certain thing is happening, I help them clarify and understand truly what's going on, what's the meaning of it, what's the history behind it, and what the future brings.
As Plato once said, ignorance is the root and stem of all evil. We the People has helped me. I've been giving back to my community and to help promote civic engagement by volunteering at the library and doing an ESL book club on some books of relevant books.
Okay, so it's my turn. Okay, so do you think that We the People should be a required course then for all students? Because considering that it's something that schools should just go to try out to actually get into the program, so how can other people who aren't in the program also seek that for it?
So I think one really cool way that people who aren't part of the program can learn about it and see benefits from it is actually coming in and watching students from We the People do testimonies or practices. In fact, a lot of my friends and peers would come and watch us as we were prepping for states, and they were like, wow, that's so cool. You talked about all these things and we had no idea about them. So I think that's a really engaging way to have other members join.
Furthermore, while I disagree with the notion that We the People should be a required class, I do think it is important that this program is available to more students, and kids are given the opportunity to have this program if they choose to do it, because of how beneficial it is to communities.
And I have to agree with my teammate Joey in that we shouldn't make it mandatory because the workload and the demand for it is just so high, given the busy workdays of students and adults alike, there's no way that it can tangibly, reasonably be implemented. Instead, I propose that we need to revamp how we do government classes. Students are currently just reading from the textbook and being lectured at, but again, we the people is good at that it applies the Constitution, and that's why I think that we need to do this. That's why I think that we need to shape government classes to be more application-based rather than textbook.
Time.
Yeah, I like your testimony. It was easy to follow. It's easy to follow. You had good evidence too. While you do one stuff. Yes, it's good evidence. I liked that when Gabby had her part, she specifically mentioned Unit 6 and her personal insight into the testimony. And added more nuance to it. And Q&A also really good. There was someone jumping in. Basically, as soon as the question was asked, but not like so fast as it seemed like you guys. It didn't seem like you guys were scared jumping in. That's good. Lots of evidence in Q&A too, which was interesting because we had a lot of like more personal experience type questions. In the end, Joey, I liked how you said you disagreed with what you said. It's a premise of the question, which I thought was really interesting. I know judges love it when you do that. And you said I agree with, or yeah, I agree. You agree with him, and it's always good to build off your panel mates like that, which is you guys really built off of each other.
I would echo what my fellow judge has said. I thought even though there is not like a three-part question like typically there is, I liked how you signposted the words rights, responsibility, and citizenship multiple times, so being very responsive. In Q&A as well, you were very good at answering the question, especially on the last one, when Javier didn't answer the first part of whether or not to make it mandatory. You made sure the rest of the panel did address that, so that question was fully answered. My one critique would be participation, making sure it's a little bit more even. I know Zoe started for a lot of the answers, so trying to balance that out.
First of all, signpost was really good. I mean, it very clear where you guys were. So, as far as the Q&A, I thought you guys were all very responsive. I like how you actually proposed a solution to my question rather than just saying I agree with it. My only critique is a little bit.
So, before I open questions up to everybody else, I do want to point out that I gave them this assignment weeks ago, and you guys really did, I think, especially like they're not getting credit for this. This is, like they've been judged. I can't give them more points. Anyway, does anybody in the audience have any questions for the panel? Is there anything that anybody really liked or had a reaction to? No? Okay. Fair. No, yeah.
Are the judges allowed to respond to the answers that they gave to the previous question?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. And in fact, so some judges, like just having a list of questions that they're going to ask for each school that they see, and that's fun. Some judges will want to challenge each school, whatever they say. I particularly will, I don't go in with written questions generally, and if somebody says something in a testimony, I want to attack them. I want to get them to back off whatever they just said, because I'm a lawyer and I'm a jerk, and that's what people do, right? I want them to, because by attacking what the argument that is made, I can determine how strongly they hold that argument, how well they're able to defend that argument, and what the reasons why they made that argument. So, yeah.
To add on there, I don't know how much attention you guys were all paying to judges' critiques, and even though this is a simulated thing, but all those critiques are actual critiques that we would give during a practice session, right? We look for evidence, we look for signposting, we look for responsiveness, we look for eye contact, right? We look for all of those things, and even though this was kind of not exactly on a specific unit, but those are the things that you want to be sort of conveying during your testimony. And it was really funny, Gabby, if I could just comment
one of your answers was the most Unit 6 answers I've ever heard. It's like, if you know about Unit 6, it's a lot about like, oh, like my personal experience, I'm able to do X, Y, and Z. And I just wanted to shout out for that. But, yeah, so I mean, definitely take notes. It's more than just a fun simulation. Definitely pretty realistic.
Any other questions? Okay, so I think we're probably going to take a quick break.
Yes. Well, once they pass the extra out, then we'll have extra. No, that's
Who's got a question? We need one more.
Okay, so you're going to be getting 3 different documents. One is going to be the district questions, which I believe Sabrina is handing out. So these are going to be all of the questions that you're going to spend from like, I don't know, August, September until December answering, once you get split in 2 units. And then importantly, you're going to get a brief summary of what the scoring criteria are that looks like this. And then I believe also a more detailed criteria of how each one of the, a detailed description of how each one of the criteria is going to be evaluated. There are 6 different topics on the scoring criteria. There's understanding, constitutional application, reasoning, evidence, responsiveness, and participation. We're going to cover 3 of them today, and then next week we'll cover the other 3. So the 3 that we're going to focus on today, and after in an hour or so, you guys are going to be split up into some small units, and we're going to get to answer any question. And as we go through that process, what we're going to want you to focus on are these 3 criteria for understanding, responsiveness, and participation. So I'm just going to give you a really brief overview of what we think, what we're looking for when we talk about each of those things, and then next week we'll cover the other 3 criteria. So the simplest one, and the criteria on which you should
Before we start, did everybody get all 3? Does anybody not have?
Okay, cool.
You've done this already.
So the simplest criteria, the one you should always get 10 points on, is participation. And what we really care about when we talk about participation is that everyone on the panel is going to contribute to the discussion. So obviously, when you write your testimony, you split it up, you're going to make sure that everyone speaks equally. But when you get to the Q&A, the hot seat, you also want to make sure that everyone is going to speak equally, right? One person shouldn't be dominating the conversation. But it's also not just about saying something, right? You can't just chime in and be like, hey, I have a nice dog. You have to say something meaningful in that conversation. You have to provide evidence. You have to provide reasoning, analysis. Demonstrate to the judges that you actually understand what you're talking about, that you're responding to their questions, and that you're actively invested in the discussion. So this is we'll beat you over the head with this in all of your practices. You have to make sure that you get even participation. It's a really easy 10 points. And it's just going to be like sort of the baseline for your score. Okay, so the next one is responsiveness. The point of responsiveness is that you have to make sure that you're answering the question. When you hear a question, your mind's going to go in a million different directions. If you hear something about the 14th Amendment, you'll start thinking about the Civil War and the other Reconstruction Amendments. So if I ask you, like, hey, tell me about what impact the 14th Amendment had on American society, you might start thinking, oh, well, right after the 14th Amendment, there's the 15th Amendment. You might start saying something about the 15th Amendment. That's not actually answering the question, right? It's relevant information, and you can find ways to tie it back to the actual question, but you can't just go off on a tangent and suddenly start telling me about the 15th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act and all sorts of other things. You have to make sure you tie it back to the original question, answer very clearly what the actual question the judge was asking is, right? And what we'll tell you to do over and over and over again is to answer the question clearly. So if you ask a yes or no question, when you start your answer, you should say, yes, I believe X, or no, I don't believe X, right? And just making sure that you phrase your answers very clearly, make sure that you're always bringing it back to the question that's being asked. And sometimes you'll say something that isn't maybe super relevant, and it's on your colleagues or unit mates to bring things back to the exact question that is being asked and make sure that you get those responses. Yeah?
Can you ask the judge to repeat a question?
Yeah. Sometimes, not always. Like this can be a stalling tactic. And sometimes, like if I ask you a very obvious question, I'm like, what do you think about X? You can't be like, hey, can you repeat? What am I going to say? Right? Like, what do you think about that? Yeah.
What if your unit mate like mistakes and doesn't get correct and another person does backtrack for them? Or
so this will you'll get a feel for this. It's a question of judgment. If it's like you cite a case, then it's like, I say Citizens United 2009, it's supposed to be 2010. Like, not a big deal. Like, you don't have to correct it. If it's like, in Brown v. Board, we ruled that separate was equal. Like, okay, maybe we should just clarify. Like, I believe my colleague meant to say like, so, and it's okay. Like we all say stupid things sometimes. It's not a big deal. Don't stress about it. Your unit mates will cover for you. And if it's the obvious thing that you misspoke on, we're not gonna ding you for saying something silly. If you demonstrate that you really don't understand what's happening, that's a whole another kind of issue, right? But assuming that you know what you were supposed to say and you just word vomited, it's totally cool.
So I'd like to jump in real quick on responsiveness. And Mr. Srikanti mentioned, if you get asked a yes or no question, the first words out of your mouth should be yes, no, or maybe it depends on something. But it's a little bit harder when it's an open-ended question. So what is the most important duty of citizenship, for example? So in my view, the best way to make sure that you're going to be responsive to that question is to use the words of the question in your answer. First words out of your mouth are, the most important duty of citizens is. And in that way, if you're using the words of the question, more often than not, you're going to be responsive, because it's very difficult to say the most important duty of citizens is baseball or something. That's completely not responsive.
Yeah, and actually, just to add on to that, it's also really useful for your other unit mates, right? Like, if your other unit mates didn't catch the question and they hear you saying, "Oh, the most important duties of the citizens are blank," then they're like, "Oh, okay, this is what I need to go off of that." So it's shows teamwork, and that also adds to participation.
Any questions about participation or responsiveness? Yeah.
Should you generally try to agree with you?
No, not always. If you agree, you should agree. If you disagree, you should disagree. One thing that you'll learn as you sort of start getting into doing actual presentations is that you have to think a little bit strategically about when you agree and disagree. So, for example, if there are 4 of you and one person says I disagree, or I agree, I believe X. Second person says I disagree, and third person says I agree with the first person. It just gets really confusing to follow. So generally, you want to group the people who agree into one block of answers and the people who disagree into another block of answers. But you should generally argue for what you believe in, right? It's pretty tough to make a convincing argument for a thing you don't believe. It's always okay to say, I don't believe this personally, but one might argue and then bring the other side in, and that's actually a really important skill that you'll learn, being able to frame the other side of the argument without necessarily taking that stance personally yourself. But you don't have to argue for things you don't believe. You'll give better, more interesting, more passionate answers if you argue for those.
Just like the framers of the Constitution, you don't need to all believe the same thing to come up with a good answer. There you go. I'm using other words.
That was not evidence. Do you have another question?
Yeah, so then generally, should you understand what your teammates' views should be so you know what to speak in turn?
Yeah, totally. And you'll get a sense for it, right? You'll get asked the same question 2, 3, 4 times, and by the 3rd time, they'll be like, "Oh, I know this person believes this thing, and I should wait until someone else agrees before I just whatever." Right?
That actually brings up a really important point. Some units become best friends for life. Some units, not so much. You're gonna be, you may be put on a unit with people that you don't know, or people you do know and already don't like. These things happen. It's high school. But one thing that's really important is that you do spend time with your units. You do get to know each other so that you do understand what each other is thinking, and you're able to read each other's body language when somebody needs help. To know what they're going to say before they say it, because that's going to make you a better unit. So you don't have to be best friends, but you do need to spend time with each other, and you do need to get to know each other.
You will have debates with your teammates at 1 in the morning about what the Constitution means to you, and it's going to be some of the best moments of your life as well.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah. No, not necessarily. It depends on how big your unit is. It depends on how substantive the question is, right? You'll get a feel for it. There's no cut and dry answer to that. Generally, you'll give 3 to 4 responses per question, but again, it really depends on the question, how much the judge jumps in and pushes back.
Yeah. And how well your unit mates have already answered it.
That's right.
I know that the judges are supposed to be impartial, obviously, because that's the job. But do you know if they're typically left leaning or right leaning, or You know, like the type of person who wants.
We live in California.
Yeah.
But outside of the Bay Area,
That's right.
California is a red state. So if you know, at the state competition, if you're lucky enough to go to the state competition, you're going to have judges from the middle of nowhere, California. You're going to have very conservative, right-wing judges. You know, for the district competition, you could probably guess that they're going to be lefty. But one of the things that I usually advise is take the politics, take the emotion out of your statement. So make sure that whatever you're saying can be supported by facts. You're not trying to play with the judges here. You're not trying to say what they want to hear. You're trying to defend a point. Because for me, you can disagree with me. You can say that, like, I think that, making same-sex marriage legal was the worst. I think of fellow v. Hodges was the worst case ever, from a decision perspective. And if you have good evidence to back up your opinion, then I want to hear it. Like, I don't agree with it, but I want to hear it.
And we've all been doing this for a while, and something that you might learn is that something that Mr. Woods and Cassie and myself like to do is be contrarian. So even when you might agree with the point that you're making, we will most definitely disagree with you for the sake of disagreeing with you, just to force you to defend your argument. So yes, especially earlier on, you might have more liberal judges, but that doesn't really matter. And the thing that we'll be looking for is not the substance, not the politics of your answer, but the substance of it. Are you able to make a clear point and defend that argument is what matters, not whether you agree with our politics or not, because that's not what we're trying to evaluate.
My favorite moment, I think it was Cuba. It was during one of our practices, and they were giving testimony or Q&A, and it was about voting rights, and somebody talks about how in North Carolina things are just completely messed up, and just basically bagging on North Carolina and like how backwards they are. Guess where I was born? Yeah, so that's the thing, is that it's important that even though I may be lefty liberal, it's important to be aware and to be fact-based in what you're saying, because you never know what somebody's leanings or somebody's history might be.
Okay, I'm gonna move on, because if you have more questions, we have finance afterwards. We're happy to answer them. The last criteria that we're gonna emphasize today is understanding. This is pretty related to responsiveness, because it's hard to respond to a question if you don't understand what the hell is being asked. But responsiveness is about the sort of direct, tactical way that you phrase your answers and making sure that you're responding to the substance of the question. Understanding is a little bit more broad. Understanding is focusing on, do you understand why this question is being asked? What is the question asking? Why is it being asked? What's the historical context for this question? What other events around the time of this question affected the way that this particular event happened, right? Do you understand the jurisprudence that relates to this question? What did the Supreme Court say? What did Congress do? All these kinds of things. So it's related to responsiveness in that you need to be able to understand the question and respond to it, but you also need to be able to contextualize things, whether it's historical, whether it's judicial, whether it's current events, whatever the topic is, right? This will vary from unit to unit. This will even vary pretty significantly from question to question. But you'll need to be able to understand the non-tactical pieces of information that help you frame the larger issue at hand, right? So whether, oftentimes this will be things like public opinion polling, understanding history, right? So for example, if you're talking about the framing and you're talking about the Philadelphia Convention, well, a lot of what happened at the Philadelphia Convention was influenced by the Annapolis Convention. So if you're not able to talk about the Annapolis Convention, then maybe you don't understand all the historical forces that were affecting the decisions that the framers made. So being able to put things in context, understand why this question is being asked, why is it interesting, what are the larger issues, and is going to be where you're going to get good or not so great understanding scores. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that. Cool. Okay. We have time for maybe one or two more questions about any of the score sheet criteria or anything else like that. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I have a question regarding testimonies in general. So, do you have to qualify what you mean if you bring up a certain term? I know that you guys brought up immigration as an example, but would you have to qualify that you meant like immigrants versus like immigrants and refugees solely, or would you have to use like a technical definition?
I think it's important to always be clear about what you say and intentional. There are things that are just universally understood, like if you talk about immigration reform, like I think that that's kind of universally an understood idea of, because there's been a lot of things going on. But if you are talking about a certain group of immigrants, then you want to be very clear about that. Like I'm talking about, undocumented immigrants who came to the country, at a young age or something like that. So, or if you're referring to a government agency, you should name the government agency before you start using the acronyms for it or those kinds of things. If you're talking about a court case, you should give the context for the court case, the year, those kinds of things. And so
specificity always helps, right? So if you, like saying immigration legislation is not super useful. You can say the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1986 said that you can do X and you can't do Y. Then one, that'll help demonstrate that you understand the history of the subject, but also you'll get evidence points for that, right? Because then you're bringing in a concrete thing that actually happened that affected the way that our government works today and so on. So yes and no, right? Like again, you'll get a feel for these things as you go.
So precision of language is one of the best ways to demonstrate understanding. So for example, if you say, well, the Constitution was passed in 1789. Well, the Constitution wasn't passed. That's what we did. We ratified it, right? And so that word is more precise. It also shows that you understand the context. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. Just a little thing. As long as you guys are talking about it, it's going to cut us off at the past months before you even start giving formal testimonies. President Trump. Not just Trump.
Right.
President Donald Trump. We'll get used to it.
Keep in mind, like you were hearing about a few minutes ago, these are congressional testimonies, right? Decorum is important here. You're going to address the judges formally. You're going to use the right term to refer to anyone that you talk about, right? You don't just like maybe in casual conversation you'll say McConnell, but you will say Senate Majority Leader McConnell, right? We will always tell you to use the correct terms, the right decorum for whoever you're referring to.
Okay. So now we will get to our great debate. So here's what we're doing from here on out. And so for the rest of the day, what we are going to be talking about are the branches of government. Does anybody know how many branches of the federal government there are? 3. That's right. Good job. Good job, guys. Can somebody, not in the back, can somebody name the 3 branches of government? Right there.
The legislative, the executive.
That's right. So, for the rest of the day, we're going to be talking about the branches of government and how powerful they are. Because there's some differences in how powerful they are. And you might notice that there are 3 branches of government, and there are 3 people standing up here today. So what we're going to be doing is that the 3 of us are going to have a little debate as to which is the most powerful branch of government. I will correctly be arguing for the judicial branch. Thank you. Thank you. Back there.
I will be arguing for the one that occurs first in the Constitution, the legislative branch.
And I will be arguing for the obvious winner, the executive branch.
So, what your job is during this debate and afterwards is you're going to have to be listening to this. They're going to be critically analyzing the things that you say. Afterwards, we're going to split you all up into units, and you guys are going to have to answer that question. Same question. Question is, and I want you to write it down. Seriously. What is the most powerful branch of government? Powerful. Okay? What is the most powerful branch of government? Because you guys are going to have to be giving a testimony on the most powerful branch of government, and then we're all going to pick apart what you say. We're all going to do a Q&A, a hot seat with you guys. That's what you're going to be doing for the rest of the time. So this is your opportunity to learn some stuff. Okay?
This is one of those places where precision of words is important, because we didn't say what is the most important branch of government. We said what is the most powerful branch of government. Right.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start because, again, I'm right. And we're going to talk a little bit, first we're going to talk a little bit about, what the founders thought. Because what they thought is relevant. It's not necessarily controlling, but it's relevant. And anytime, even if you're in Unit 5 or Unit 6, you will get questions about the founders, even though that's more of a Unit 1, Unit 2 question. So, when the founders were getting together in the Philadelphia Convention, they spent a lot of time on these two over here. They spent so much time. Article 1 is super long. There are all of these, well, you can do this, you can't do that, you can do this, you can't do that. It's a long list of things. Article 2, a little bit shorter, but there are some significant limitations. Article 3, they just kind of went, the judicial power shall be vested here in the Supreme Court, and then some other courts, if we want. That's it. They didn't limit it, and that's the point. That's the real crux of my argument, is that the founders didn't think about how powerful the judicial branch would be. In fact, and I'm sure these guys are going to mention it a little bit, this guy who you will hear about a little bit going forward, this guy Alexander Hamilton. Anybody heard of him?
Wow.
Who's seen or listened to Hamilton? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So this guy, he writes a lot of Federalist papers, right? And he wrote this Federalist paper called, The Other 51. Fed 78, it's one of my favorite Fed papers, where he said emphatically that it is the duty of the judicial branch to determine what the law is. The judicial branch gets the final say. He mentioned it. He was talking about, what was he talking about? He was talking about this thing called judicial review. You'll learn a lot about judicial review, but judicial review is this concept that means, at the end of the day, the Supreme Court gets the final say as to whether or not something follows the Constitution or doesn't follow the Constitution. So, the Supreme Court has it, and they've used it throughout history. We'll talk a little bit more about that. He also said in that Federalist paper that the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, is the weakest branch. He said that. But, Hamilton also thought the Reynolds pamphlet was a good idea. He also said that, the Electoral College was a good idea. Hamilton was kind of an idiot sometimes. And so I reject that. And I think that he was wrong about that. And that's pretty much what the founders thought about the judicial branch when they made it.
I tend to think they didn't think very much of the judicial branch. And the reason that Article 3 is so short is because the judicial branch was not viewed as a co-equal branch. It was viewed as a supplementary branch of government. The idea of judicial review, where the courts get to decide what's in the law, is something that evolved over time. It may have been in Fed 76. It may have been in Marbury v. Madison, but you know where it wasn't? The Constitution. So Alexander Hamilton said a lot of things in Fed 76, but he also said a lot of things in Fed 70, such as taking it for granted, therefore, that all men of sense will agree in the necessity of an energetic executive. It will only remain to inquire, what are the ingredients which constitute this energy? How far can they be combined with those other ingredients which constitute safety in the Republican sense? That's founders' words for, I want a strong executive power. I think that it's going to be really important that this nation is governed by a strong executive. Part of that strength of the executive is the ability to decide how laws are enforced. That is one of the main powers of the executive that was given to the executive in Article 2. That power allows the executive to interpret the law. So the judicial interpretation is answering. It is secondary. Part of the reason that the founders wanted a strong executive branch was because the Articles of Confederation had just proven that a weak executive or not having a centralized government was a really bad idea. You know, they'd gone through the revolution, the articles had barely held them together through that, and then Shays' Rebellion happened. And they realized that not having the ability to raise taxes or an army, not having central control of things was a bad idea. So during the Constitutional Convention, there were a couple of different ideas that were presented. There was the, you know, we'll learn about these as we go through, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And the Virginia plan was a single executive, and the Jersey plan essentially was multiple people. It was elected by Congress. Obviously, more of the Virginia plan won out. But in the end, they kind of just ran out of time because they had to come up with a constitution that everybody could agree on. And so they're like, yeah, okay, that's good. And they didn't put a ton of limitations on the executive. You know, and we've seen the results of that today in the power of what the executive is able to do today.
I'm glad that my colleague brought up the Articles of Confederation, because one of the reasons why it was so weak and that it was a failure is because Congress did not have the power to tax or regulate commerce. And that is what the Founding Fathers decided to add to the Congress and the Constitution that we have today. And that's why it makes Congress one of the strongest, the most powerful branch of government. The founders designed the legislative branch to be the most powerful because they wanted our government to flow from the people. They rejected a strong executive from the British government that they came from. And the judiciary branch, like my colleague said, was barely thought of in the Constitution. In contrast, the congressional branch is completely laid out and is the longest section of the Constitution. And it lists several broad sweeping powers that Congress has to affect our day-to-day lives on a sweeping scale. Congress has the power to tax and spend, to regulate interstate commerce, to declare war, raise and support armies, and they also set the supreme law of the land. So they govern what states have the ability to do. And furthermore, there is the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8, which says that they can do whatever they need in order to facilitate these other powers that were established. This gives them sweeping power, and that was the intent. In Federalist 33, our dear friend Alexander Hamilton wrote that the congressional powers are only declaratory of a truth, which would have resulted by necessary and unavoidable implication from the very act of constituting a federal government, investing it with certain specified powers. He's saying that the strongest branch of government is the legislative branch, and that's because it's inevitable of having a federal government that's strong and effective. And furthermore, in Federalist 51, James Madison, another founding father, wrote that in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. That shows that it's by far the strongest branch of government, and that the founding fathers considered it so that the people could have an influence on what was going on.
I guess so. So from here, one of the two there are two concepts that we're going to be talking a lot about for the rest of the year, and that is protection of individual rights and protection of the promotion of individual rights, and then also the common good. So now we're going to talk about how our branches protect individual rights or promote individual rights.
So I would like to say in somewhat of a rebuttal that yes, the founders gave a lot of thought to Article 1, and part of the reason it's so long is that there are so many prohibitions on what Congress can do and so many limitations. Those prohibitions have, and also just the idea of pluralism and needing to have many people come to a decision on things, have rendered Congress, as we know, pretty much superfluous at this point. So from an aspect of protecting individual rights, you see today in what's going on in the Trump administration just how much impact the executive has on individual rights. Now, not in a positive way, but what that tells you is how much control the president, the executive, has over individual rights. The expansion of the administrative state, which is under the executive authority, basically means that while laws may be written by Congress, the administrative state creates regulations, and those regulations are pretty much supplanted or replaced the making of laws as far as your day-to-day life. The president, first of all, swears an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. The president appoints Supreme Court justices, so has power over the justices in determining who gets to sit on that bench to then decide on cases on protecting or limiting individual rights. The president has the ability to issue executive orders. There were things like Executive Order 13672 under President Obama, where workplace protections were put in place for LGBT workers. Or Executive Order 9981 when Truman desegregated the military. There's a huge leap forward for individual rights. And all done without Congress, without the judiciary, just by the power of the executive.
So the reason that the executive can take those actions is because Congress allowed them to do so. Congress at any point could create a law to stop the president from doing many of those executive orders or to allow for them. And so Congress is actually exercising its power when it chooses not to act in certain areas. But it actually has affirmatively acted to protect individual rights. The legislative branch is able to affirmatively take action on many issues that these other branches actually just have to react to. The president enforces the laws that Congress makes, and the Supreme Court and the judicial branch reviews those laws under a very narrow set of circumstances, interpreting laws for what they might mean. But Congress has the power to outline exactly what they'll look like. Congress is responsible for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in many different areas, and actually impacting people on a day-to-day basis immediately. Also, the Americans with Disabilities Act protects discrimination for people who have disabilities. The Voting Rights Act helps to protect many of the people's ability to vote. And also, and Congress has the ability, even if it hasn't exercised it recently, to actually resolve many of the key issues that we're discussing today. Congress could pass the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals and stop the debates altogether about protecting individuals who came here as children and giving them a path to citizenship. They would also be able to help people who are pro-choice. They could affirmatively grant that right at a congressional level. Congress can protect rights that aren't spelled out in the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is a bottom line, but Congress can act to affirmatively protect when the Supreme Court or the executive are choosing not to go that extra mile. For example, the Religious Freedom for Restoration Act was passed after the Supreme Court interpreted the First Amendment on the free exercise clause to say that if a law was made of general applicability, then people wouldn't be violating their free exercise clause, even if it really substantially burdened their exercise of their religion. But Congress stepped in with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and gave that right back, even though the bare minimum of the Bill of Rights said it was fine. So this shows that Congress is able to affirmatively protect rights in a way that these other branches cannot.
I heard a lot about what Congress could theoretically do, but not a whole lot about what Congress is actually doing. This Congress especially, and Congress generally, has not done a whole lot. They can't get out of their own way. And so, I think that, yes, it's possible that they can pass those laws, but if they pass a law, who gets the final say as to whether or not that law comports with the Constitution? Guess what? It's the judiciary. Who gets the final say as to say whether the administrative state that my colleague talked about as promoting individual rights, whether that passes constitutional muster? Guess what? It's the judiciary. This notion that the judicial review was not in the Constitution and was just sort of something that was tacked on later, I reject that notion. I think that's wrong. The power of judicial review is inherent in the judicial power. It flows from common law, which is what courts in our common law system coming from England do with any law. They interpret it. And so in interpreting it, they create law. And so ultimately, judicial we talked a little bit about checks and balances. You're going to hear a lot about it, but judicial review is like the most powerful one. It's like, I don't know, Charizard or whatever the really important Pokemon is. I don't know. It's like the most important one. It's the final hammer. And it's been used to promote individual rights and protect individual rights. None of the branches have even come close to protecting individual rights more than the judicial branch has. For example, did Congress determine that the 14th Amendment incorporated the Bill of Rights? No. It was the judiciary. Thank you. Did Congress limit the executive's war powers? No, they didn't. Did Congress desegregate education in Brown v. Board? No, they didn't. Did the executive get rid of anti-miscegenation laws? No, they didn't. That was the judiciary. Did Congress establish the constitutional right to privacy? No, that was the judiciary. Did Congress gut the Voting Rights Act a few years ago? No, that was the judiciary. They were wielding that power. The judiciary passed the law, the Congress passed the law, the executive signed it, and the judiciary, using judicial review, just using their power, decided no, it didn't pass constitutional muster. Did the executive legalize same-sex marriage? We talked about that earlier. No, they didn't. That was the judiciary. And so this notion about which branch protects individual rights is a no-brainer from my perspective. It's the judiciary.
Rights. The courts do have their last say, but oftentimes they don't even use the last say. For instance, the most recent case about gerrymandering in Bishop v. Common Cause, the court said, this is a political question, a question for Congress to solve. And so I think that's important. And as we turn to the question about who does a better job of protecting the common good, I think it's pretty clear that the legislative branch does that. Because first of all, they uphold the legitimacy of government, and that's crucial for the functioning of all the branches. The Congress is the one that's ruled by the people. Every person has a representative or multiple representatives that they go to, who then go to Congress and make the laws that represent them. And that gives people faith in our government. At the judicial branch, there's often talk about them just being based off the political leaning and choosing of the executive branch. How many justices do we have on the Supreme Court that are conservative? 5. Everyone knows that. How many who are liberal? 4. And our faith in government is constantly eroded by this idea that 9 people get to decide many of these issues. But the power actually comes from Congress and the people. And so the greatest thing about the common good is it lends legitimacy. But it also has the ability to take affirmative actions to allow for the common good to be protected. One of the most prominent roles that Congress has played in this area is the passage of the Environmental Protection Act, which helps to create wide sweeping laws that would allow this country to be better responsible for environmental laws. And they're responsible for that. Furthermore, the Affordable Care Act was passed, which by Congress, which was to give people access to affordable health care, including people who have pre-existing conditions. This is something that's for the common good of everyone in this country. Furthermore, Congress doesn't always act for the common good, but that's them exercising their power in doing so. Even when Congress is not acting, they're exerting their power and their policy goals. When the executive branch is doing something and Congress doesn't stop it, that's them allowing the executive branch to continue doing that without taking any of the blame and upholding a lot. And so that's exerting their power in really important ways. Courts regularly advocate their role in protecting the common good. And so it's clear the legislative branch, which has an impact in our lives in many different ways. And Congress hasn't really advocated their role. In the Obama administration, over 1,000 laws were passed. And many of them are being developed now. There's bipartisan support to stop robocalls, which all of us, that's something that's really important for the common good, that we stop our robocalls. So Congress can be productive, even if sometimes these high-profile issues dominate what's going on. What's actually happening on the ground is affecting all of us.
Oh, the scourge of robocalls.
It's just naming post offices.
Yeah, the naming post offices. It's so important. So again, the the difference with the judiciary, and it is not popularly elected, but the judiciary is, first of all, it's more than just the Supreme Court. It's the Supreme Court, it's the circuit courts, it's all of the courts that I practice in every day. And the branch itself is a common good. It is a dispute resolution mechanism, which means that anytime anybody has a dispute, rather than, like doing trial by combat, you get to go to a judge who says, no, party A wins, party B loses. This dispute mechanism is a common good. The branch itself is a reflection of rule of law, which is a concept that society cannot exist, or a civil society cannot exist without rule of law. The branch itself does that. And there are tons of times when the Supreme Court and its lower courts have made decisions to advance the common good. For example, in 1905, there was a case with the Supreme Court called Jacobson v. Massachusetts, which held that mandated vaccines for the common good are constitutional and are a justifiable use of state power. That was the Supreme Court saying, we don't want people to get sick, even though it might conflict with some individual rights. My colleague previously mentioned the Commerce Clause as this big, broad power that Congress has used to protect individual rights and promote the common good. Well, who gets to decide what the boundaries of that Commerce Clause power is? It's the judiciary. The final say always comes to us. The judiciary has a long litany of equal protection cases, making sure that the law is applied equally, or ideally equally, or more equally than it has in the past. That is a promotion of the common good. So again, when you're talking about whether or not a branch is more powerful or less powerful, the final say in promoting the common good, promoting individual rights, comes to the judiciary.
Well, I think we all know what I'm going to say right now. Not true. We talked about an individual right. My colleague talked about how it wasn't the executive that desegregated the schools in Brown v. Board. Well, do you know who it was who enforced Brown v. Board? Executive Order 10730, Eisenhower federalized the National Guard to desegregate Little Rock School. So the judiciary may say things, but they still need the power of enforcement to get it done. That's the president's job. That's the executive's job. The legislative branch may pass things like the Environmental Protection Act, but it's the job of the EPA under the administrative state, under the executive branch, to determine how that act is enforced. And as we just saw in the news, there was just a consideration of a ban on a pesticide that's causing issues in children's health, that the Trump administration's EPA decided to leave the pesticides out there to sicken children, because the EPA gets to determine what clean air and clean water are. So it's not the legislative that gets to decide that, it's the executive. FEMA, yeah, well, but they have it. FEMA, the FDA, etc. It's interesting also that my colleague talked about the functioning of all branches, because we all know that Congress is complete dysfunction. Necessarily, by the way that it was constructed, it cannot function adequately. It is meant to be this place that slows everything down. The president has the ability to promote the common good through a number of different mechanisms. One of those is, of course, we just talked about executive orders. The president also has the power of the bully pulpit. Now, that was a term that was first used back in Roosevelt's time, but it really applies today, as you see with President Trump using Twitter. He has the power to connect directly and to use the power of his office for good or for ill, but it's still power. We saw the executive executing a lot of power during the New Deal, when FDR basically pulled the country out of the Depression, enacting a whole lot of changes that really benefited the common good, building railroads and roads and infrastructure in this country. The president has the power to negotiate treaties and veto bad legislation. So Congress may pass whatever laws it wants, but the president gets to veto them. And ultimately, Congress may have the power to declare war, but as we've seen, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. So he can make decisions to go to war, and Congress can go, I don't think you're supposed to do that. And we're at war. So goes on to Iran. So I think what we see is that the executive is the most powerful branch, both in the founders' views, as well as in the ability to protect individual rights and promote the common good.
Okay. So we're going to open it up to questions. Do any of the alumni have questions for us?
Hi.
And
So if we're going to talk about the judicial branch here and its decisions, or any of the branches in general, what about like Dred Scott, U.S. United, and hasn't the court also questioned the decision? It hasn't the executive enforces decisions. So, but if we look to Dred Scott, for example, we can see that it was overturned by the 14th Amendment. So wouldn't that kind of give Congress most of the power then, considering that the other two branches have made some questionable decisions? I wanted to say that for like.
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question is given the Supreme Court's long history of screwing up, doesn't that mean that they're not powerful? Basically, and I would push back on the premise of that question. In fact, Dred Scott was mentioned. It's the worst decision in Supreme Court history, if not. It's definitely in the top 5. It basically started the Civil War. That's a reflection of power, guys. I'm not saying that the power is always used correctly. It's often not. I can tell you will hear at long length a list of ways in which the Supreme Court has not used that power well, but they've used it. It's there. The fact that the legislature and the states had to pass a constitutional amendment to overturn Dred Scott is a reflection of power, because you had to literally change the Constitution in order to get rid of this terrible decision that the Supreme Court made. Korematsu is another great example. This time it was, the executive wanting to round up Japanese folks, which was terrible. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's okay. Hawaii v. Trump, very similar decision in my view. Now, again, it's not a question of whether it's good or bad. We're not arguing whether it's good, although like Congress would lose that one, sure. But,
The federal government.
The federal government. It's about which branch has the most power. And I would say that all of those cases that you listed are an expression of that power.
Well, I mean, I would say, sure, the 13th and 14th Amendment were a response to Dred Scott, but what predated that? The Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is what overturned Dred Scott. So, executive order.
So the whole first part of your debate was about what the framers thought, but it was really just a weird homage to Alexander Hamilton. Weak citation effect that you want in Madison. So, but Hamilton is kind of monarchist, and why don't like Adams and Jefferson and Madison, John Jay, why was there not more citation of their opinions in that debate?
Because you weren't up here.
I think one of the reasons why is they were all anti-federalists, or not John Jay, but most of the people are anti-federalists. And so that's more of a debate between the power of the federal government and the power of the state government. It's sort of a different debate. And so a lot of the people we cited today are people who focused on what the 3 branches of government at the federal level, what it really means. And that's why it's important to unpack, because the Federalists got their way. They got a powerful federal government. So understanding how they viewed what should be the most powerful among them, the legislative branch, is really important to understanding how our society and how the government functions today.
Also, Adams is a son.
Yes, sorry for all the names you said.
Yeah.
Wouldn't the name recognition and popularity of the executive, specifically like the office of the presidency among the common people, give the executive branch immense sway over other branches. Like, for example, as we see in the current administration, it wouldn't be of the office of the basically make it so there would be so much political sway over the Congress that Congress going against the bill, which is from the president, wouldn't that be
Damn right. That is the definition of the bully pulpit. So that is one of the powers of the presidency, and you got a single voice, and they have the power of this office to push for their views. You know, whether it be fireside chats or presidential debates or Twitter. You know, the president has the ability to, as a singular voice, connect directly with the people, and have this power of the office give a weight and a command to what you speak.
So the president does have a bully pulpit, but we also, as Congress is in every person's district, in every person's state. They're represented, and they have a bully pulpit of their own to their people, and people often feel more connected to the representatives than to the federal government as a whole. And that's reflected by the high incumbency rates in Congress, of people re-electing their representatives and their senators time and time again, but also having a more poorer reflection on the federal government as a whole, even though that they support. And so it's important to realize that there's still a bully pulpit in the representatives. But also, it's not political suicide to go against what the president says. And oftentimes people are heartened by their Congress people pushing back. I mean, the House of Representatives right now is certainly not supportive of a lot of things that President Trump is doing. They are pushing back on some of the racist comments he has said about Congress people. They are pushing back on what the President Trump's actions are and what he's saying is okay and not okay, in terms of creating a wall between the United States and Mexico, in terms of filing doing the Mueller report and investigations into President Trump's activities. And so it's not political suicide to go against what the president says. And in fact, it actually gives Congress more power because the people feel heartened to hear that they are pushing back on things that the president says. So while it has sway, it's not the last bit.
I just want to follow up and say, I think it's a great question. You know, this idea of like, oh, what will the people think? Speaking as the judiciary, I don't care. Doesn't matter. We're not elected. We have the final say anyway, so like, it doesn't matter. What's that?
Bully pulpited the crap out of Nightcrawler.
Exactly. I mean, but in the end, like, the Supreme Court doesn't have to worry about that. So, right there.
You have said as the executive branch that people want to, and people care about their representatives, that people actually do know who their representatives are. But as a citizen of the United States, I do not even know who my representative is. And I'm very sure. And I'm very sure that a lot of teenagers who are not active participants in government and a lot of other people who are not citizens entirely do not have that kind of voice or that kind of power to be able to elect their representatives. So how can you keep saying that as a people and as a group, as a nation, that we can get anything done when a lot of people don't actually know what's happening?
I mean, that's a great question, and that's something that we're definitely going to talk about a lot in this group. Is, you know, who gets to vote, whether or not there should be a constitutional amendment. You know, there have been constitutional amendments to expand suffrage, whether it be the 19th Amendment expanding to women, or the 26th Amendment expanding to, what's that?
I don't remember.
The 26th expanding to 18-year-olds. You know, there's been talk of, I don't know, look it up. Everybody's got their own little constitution here. I'm pretty sure I'm right. 19th was women, and and then 26 was 18-year-olds.
Good call.
Bam! But there's also talk about expanding suffrage to down to 16-year-olds. Expanding suffrage to ex-felons, restoring voting abilities after they've served their time. I mean, who represents you? I mean, I would also argue that high incumbency rates don't mean that people are happy with their individual representatives. I would argue that that means that the political machine is working. and that it's actually the opposite of people being happy with their individual representatives. But I think that that's a really good question. And it's something that we're going to dig into more in this.
Right, next up.
So when you were talking about the executive branch and the power that they have over the common good, you mentioned Eisenhower's enforcement of Brown v. Board and allowing African Americans to attend white schools. And at the same time, you mentioned the executive branch's enforcement of the EPA. But all the things that you mentioned make the executive branch sound like the errand boy of the judicial branch. You're talking about how when the judicial branch approves, makes a like they argue for a certain way on a court case, or they make a certain judgment. After that, then the executive branch makes an effect on it. They try to enforce that law. So, is the power really with the judicial branch in that case, or is it with the executive branch?
Well, in that case, that was enforcement of congressional and judicial decisions. But when Truman desegregated the military, that wasn't the legislative. That wasn't a reaction to the legislative branch. It wasn't a reaction to the judicial branch. That was his decision. Roosevelt in the New Deal. Again, that was a lot of his actions were because of the inability of Congress to act quickly enough to help get the country out of the Depression. So there are times when the executive acts in a reactive way, but that is in executing its enforcement power. But there are lots of times when it's not responding to anything else done. They're making their own decision. Wow, a lot of questions now, right here.
So given that the executive branch has checks, well, given that the other two branches have checks on the executive, namely Congress can impeach the president even though they vote the Constitution, is held by the opposition party to the current President Trump. And given that the judicial branch is supposed to review the laws and the executive is supposed to enforce the laws, to someone's previous point that isn't the executive branch the messenger boy of the judicial, well, you can look at Worcester v. Georgia and their decision that from President Andrew Jackson that John Marshall has made his decision to let him enforce it. The executive branch can basically ignore what is told to do, and no one's going to try and impeaching the president in Congress now because that would be political suicide. It didn't work after Bill Clinton was impeached but not removed from office. And with the courts, FDR basically told the courts to stop begging him to stop making his moves after he threatened to act the court. And so even now, the presidential candidates from the Democrat Party are threatening to increase the number of Supreme Court justices, which they can do. And if they take over more of Congress, they could add more justices to the Supreme Court and basically every time the Supreme Court doesn't do what the executive wants, they can just add more justices.
Sure.
It's called boycott.
So,
But
yeah.
it's done with the consent of Congress.
Yeah. And I want to address this point. So the question is basically, what about the fact that, the other two branches can ignore Supreme Court decisions, which is true. It's true, and it's happened very, very rarely, but that's a constitutional crisis. So it's a problem of our system of government that the Supreme Court doesn't have enforcement power. In addition, like the question about impeachment, this is an area where I believe the founders screwed up. They shouldn't have given it to the political branch because they can't get their shit together, quite frankly. And that's the problem. And so they should have given it to us, to the judicial branch, to determine whether or not somebody should be impeached. So I agree with you that is a problem. That is a limitation that the judicial branch has. But it's a limitation that, if invoked, basically we're in a lot bigger problems than we have.
I would like to say, though, that just because our current Congress can't get along or figure out some outcome that you find desirable, the fact that they have the power to do so in the Constitution themselves, that they can sit down and discuss removing the leader of this country, shows that they have the most power fundamentally, even if they don't exercise it. And I think that's more a function of how educated our citizenry is in trying to select political representatives, and also the political machine, as mentioned before, I think mucks up all three branches of government and how they function. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, but doesn't necessarily undermine the fundamental power granted to the legislative branch in the Constitution.
Okay. All right. We've got to kind of move on at this point, because otherwise we'll be here all day. I would
be here all day.